So on the issue of fossils, a major line of evidence that the evolutionary community looks to for not only human evolution, but also whale evolution. And so the question here on the screen, how do creationists, which you and I are, address the famous whale series? So you got Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Rodhocetus, Basilosaurus, for example. What are your overall thoughts on that series?
I did a whole article on this, and it's pretty clear to me that what you are doing is taking different animals and lining them up, even though they are clearly different animals. Pakicetus, for example, and the others, they're clearly different animals, different category, and you're lining them up somewhat arbitrarily. Interesting, I went to a conference once, and the professor there was at the University of Kansas, and he was asked what is the most persuasive fossil evidence for evolution, period. And at the conference, he gave the whale. And I thought, that is really bad. If this is the best evidence, what does that say about all the other evidence in that? I think it's pretty pathetic. And again, you believe in evolution, therefore, the Pakicetus and so on. These have to be missing links. But in many ways, if you do comparisons, even from the printed literature, you can see that they're just very different kinds of animals. It's like you line up apes and you start out with chimp and you gorilla and then humans, you line them all up and you claim that one evolved from the other, when that is pretty questionable, because they not only have to evolve new traits, but have to lose a lot of traits. And
right.
I don't see that as the key. I don't remember all the points in my article, but I did, in quite a long article, cover this in quite a bit of detail.
Right. And I think the point holds true even to whale evolution that you made earlier with human evolution, that a lot of the points are contested. I mean, Ambulocetus, I think it was Peter Gangrich, recently said that Ambulocetus must not be in that main lineage because the eyes are at the top of its head, kind of like an alligator. And so how can it therefore be in that main lineage? But one thing they like to point to, as you know, Dr. Bergman, and your book, which I have behind me, Fossil Forensics, you got an excellent section on this, dealing with the argument that says these whales have a vestigial pelvis. Specifically Basilosaurus, they point to these hind limbs that exist, and they say this demonstrates that they used to walk on land as four-legged tetrapods. What's a good way to respond to that, Jerry?
Well, I remember the example I used, but it's not easy to calculate when you're a whale in the water, floating around, etc. And those legs that they have really facilitate copulation. And that same thing is true with snakes that have feet-like appendages. Facilitates copulation, which I don't see how they could copulate without having some type of means of ensuring that the copulation can occur. They go extinct, but they haven't gone extinct. And of course, therefore, copulation has to be successful. And with snakes that have these so-called leg remnants, tail, and the same thing with Basilosaurus.
And the fact that Basilosaurus might have more prominent, quote unquote, hind limbs doesn't further their evolutionary model, correct?
No, it doesn't. And from the literature I've read, it's pretty clear that they need to have these structures to be able to successfully reproduce.
Well, there's at least one paper from the conventional literature that I read that said, yes, these so-called hind limbs on Basilosaurus were used for reproductive purposes. Those muscles and tendons and that structure helps with the reproductive organ. And so evolution requires the passing on of genes, right, Dr. Bergman? And so if there's no reproduction, then there's no evolution.
Right. That's it. It's the end.
So a lot of evolutionists, would you see this as a rescue device? So I see a lot admit now, well, okay, the vestigial pelvis does have a function in reproduction, but it's simply a function that's been repurposed. So they used to be hind limbs, but once they started to become reduced as they moved into the water, the ocean, now the function is been repurposed to reproduction.
Yeah, they use that, I agree, as a rescue technique, and that's reasoning. And of course, reasoning is cheap. When I taught forensics, you can reason all you want to, but You've got to have the evidence. You've got to present it to a jury, and you've got the defendant's attorneys. You don't have the evidence clear, the other attorney is going to tear you apart. And that's why before they go to court, they usually make sure that these ideas can be carefully documented in the court trial. And the same thing is with claims of a Basilosaurus. That's a rescue device, which my question is, how did they reproduce until they had those organs? If they were feet, how are they going to reproduce? They couldn't. So
right, that's a great point. There's so many major changes that would have to take place to go from a land dwelling mammal like Pakicetus to a whale like Basilosaurus, a blue whale. Can you touch on some of those changes? Maybe, like, obviously they'd have to give birth to live young in the water. Now they'd have to have the nostrils moved to the back of the head as a blowhole.
Right. Yeah, a lot of changes that I think, when I gave that example, that professor from University in Kansas, I think they really have a hard time arguing for the evolution of whales, and they do it the best they can, I guess. And it's not, I don't remember all the arguments I used in my paper. It's been like 20 years ago, but I have a book I did on the whole whale issue, and I haven't gotten it published yet. I need to find a publisher. I want to have a lot of illustrations. That would be important for this kind of book, but
yes,
you can only do one thing at a time. And I'm rewriting, by the way, the Scopes Trial book. I found so much good information that I want to rewrite it quite extensively, partially because my first book is the first book that really pointed directly in the idea that this whole concern was racism. And I need to defend that better, and I need to go into more detail to a lot of these things that I raised in my first book. So,
very good. So you have that whale series, as you know, and you've got something like a Pakicetus going into Ambulocetus, eventually Basilosaurus. And so they look to extant whales, modern day whales, and they look to these so-called vestigial hind limbs that they say are evidence that whales used to walk on land. What's a good response to that, Dr. Grady?
Well, it's not true. First of all, Ian is totally mistaken. He's been convinced by evolutionists of a lie. And I would like to point out, let's talk about the snakes that supposedly had rear legs while we're talking about the whales that supposedly had rear legs, because it's related. The fact of the matter is, these are not the degeneration. This is not the retrogressive or, concept of vestigial organs that evolutionists try to promote people into thinking. The fact of the matter is that these are very cleverly designed structures. First of all, in the case of both whales or certain snakes, these are not degenerate legs. These are structures which help to mate, positioning the female and male. Or in the case of the whales in particular, not only is that true, but also these are excellent design features, because if you don't have those bones, which are actually anchors to the muscles that go from the front to the back of the animal, in order for a whale to be able to move its tail up and down as it does, if it doesn't have these bones there to anchor shorter, smaller muscles, then you'd have to have muscles that went the entire length of the animal. Well, those muscles would be so huge you couldn't accommodate the animal. But because these are actually anchor points, you can have smaller muscles running from the front to midpoint, and then from midpoint to tail, that are smaller and will fit inside the animal very nicely. So they are not degenerate legs. These are actually very cleverly engineered anchor points for the attachment of muscles that makes the creature work, versus the fact that it could not if those bones didn't exist there.
Is that another, in a way, fulfilled expectation or prediction from the creation model? Because we would expect function rather than evolutionary leftovers. And you're pointing out that these structures are there for functional purposes.
There is no such thing as a retrogressive or vestigial organ or structure in any creature. The fact that we find things that we cannot explain doesn't mean that they don't have a specific function. It means that we've simply not been smart enough to figure it out yet. The fact of the matter is that, for instance, Dr. Wiedersheim's book in 1895 listed 180 structures or organs in the human body that were no longer needed or were on their way out in the evolutionary concept that they were going to be replaced with something new. But today we now know that there was at least one or more specific uses for each of these vessels, organs, etc.,
Yes.
that Wiedersheim mentioned. There is no such thing as junk DNA. There is no such thing as a vestigial or retrogressive organ or structure in any creature. And if there is something there that we can't figure it out, it's just because we haven't been smart enough to figure it out yet. You know, think with me just logically for a moment. No one creates anything without a purpose. And therefore, when we find something, we know that when God created it, there was a purpose. If we can't figure it out yet, it's just because we've not been smart enough to do it. He was.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it doesn't have one. And so we have to continue the search until we find out what it is. Yes, that's fine. But there is no such thing as a vestigial or retrogressive organ or structure in any creature. And Wiedersheim's book on humans was a classic example that we have disproven it and found at least one or more useful functions for every single thing he listed.
I'm going to share screen and just go over about a minute of this video from Crash Course. Let me know if the audio is coming in. And right here, great channel. I utilize it all the time for genetics and biology related study. And he's got a video, evidence for evolution. Evolution, it's a thing. So once we're done with Vice Rhino with Kent, we are going to go through the whole video. Line by line, sentence by sentence. We'll give our commentary. Kent will give his commentary. But he does provide whale evolution, the whale series, as an example of irrefutable evidence for common descent. Many other channels have done the same, stated clearly, for example. And so I want to play just a minute of this video. But mind you, our next episode or video on this topic, probably in the next few weeks or so, we'll be going through this entire video, sentence by sentence, line by line. So let me hit mute on my end so there's no echo, and we'll let him lay out the argument.
For instance, fossils taught us that whales used to walk. Whales are cetaceans, a group of mammals that includes porpoises and dolphins, and biologists long suspected that whales descended from land mammals. Partly because some modern whales still have the vestigial remnants of a pelvis and hind limb bones. But it wasn't until recently, the 1990s and 2000s, that the pieces really came together. First, paleontologists discovered fossils of Dorodons, cetaceans that had different skulls from modern whales but still had the same vestigial leg bones. Then they found even older fossil remains from another cetacean that actually had hind legs and a pelvis. But the pelvis wasn't fused to the backbone like ours is, so it did swim like a whale. But more importantly, it still had ankle bones, and they were ankle bones that are unique to the order that includes bison, pigs, hippos, and deer. So by following these clues left behind in fossilized bones, paleontologists were able to track the origin of whales back to the same origin as bison and pigs. This leads us to another series of facts that evolution explains, not how animals...
Okay, so let's stop it there. Gave us a few examples to work with, Durodon, Rodhocetus, and I'm going to go through all of the common examples. We're going to go through the so-called vestigial hind limbs, or in those cases, miniature hind limbs. And so I will share screen here, and we're going to have some fun. Whale evolution. Does this supposed whale series provide irrefutable evolution for or evidence for common descent? Matt, is that coming in okay? Audio, everything good? Okay. You're on mute, but I'm assuming you said yes. Yes. So did whales evolve from a land mammal like Crash Course says here? The evidence actually And I would say unsurprisingly says no. And I'll explain why in this presentation. It's interesting. Charles Darwin, when he first proposed an idea for how whales came about, he thought, and he went into a description as to why bears may have evolved into whales, given how they spend lots of time in the water. And so, as you can see here, we've got a phylogeny in figure 1 from Indohyus, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Basilosaurus, and then modern cetaceans. Cetaceans, based on phylogenetic data, according to the evolutionary model, are most similar to artiodactyls. And those are hoofed mammals that include hippos, pigs, and deer. Now, as we know, whales today, they're constrained to the sea. And advocates of common descent, like our friend here from Crash Course, believe there was a time when whales walked. And that's how he started off his argument there. The fossils of these so-called walking whales actually go back about 50 million years. And so they have somewhere between like 8 and 10 million years to take, Matt, to take this, notice over here, Pakicetus, this small wolf-like creature, or if you want to go with Indohyus, even smaller, from my understanding, into a blue whale. 100 feet. This is a gray whale, but a blue whale can grow to 100 feet. Here's a Pakicetus. Just notice the size comparison. And so they have a very small amount of time to explain. Basilosaurus was massive as well, 75 feet, I believe. And so here's a size comparison, Pakicetus, skeleton, with a fully aquatic whale. And so relatively short amount of time, evolutionary speaking, for these pressures, gene flow, natural selection, epigenetics, mutations, all the different mechanisms that they look to explain whale evolution. And so there's a lot of wishful thinking and storytelling, unfortunately, in this argument. And we're going to cover all of that. So here's the icons of whale evolution in a nutshell. Okay, so we got Indohyus and Pakicetus. And I'm going to show everybody why this is the case, that these two examples are just small land mammals. Ambulocetus, Myocetus, Pakicetus, and Rodhocetus were amphibious mammals, similar to what we see today with sea lions, a walrus, for example. And they were well designed for that transitional environment between sea and land. And they spent part of their lives on land and parts in water. And so it kind of makes sense of their morphology, intermediate morphology. Basilosaurus and Durodon, that's an easy one. They were just fully aquatic whales, now extinct. So here's an example of their icons, starting with Indohyus at the bottom, who isn't even categorized as a cetacean. Indohyus would be, taxonomically speaking, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species would be in the artiodactyl group. Okay, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, all the way up to Basilosaurus and blue whale. So notice that these can be broken down into fully terrestrial. So there's massive gaps. I'm going to show even more the gaps that exist. Then you got primarily terrestrial with this group, Ambulocetus, Rodhocetus, and then fully aquatic. But all of the walking whales are either fully terrestrial animals or amphibious land animals, similar to sea lions or otters. The most important transition of all, from amphibious to fully aquatic, is missing. So again, here's a size comparison. Definitely stretches the imagination to believe that a little wolf-like creature evolved into the blue whale. Over time, indirectly, of course. It's not a straight line, the evolutionary model. So Pakicetus. Pakicetus is considered a cetacean primarily because of its ear bone, which scientists argue is similar to modern cetaceans, whales today, but different in all extant land-dwelling mammals. This is a specialized thickened ear bone. The involucrum is what it's called in technical terms. And it helps cetaceans to hear underwater. Now, Indohyus actually also has this special ear bone, and yet isn't classified as a cetacean like Pakicetus. It's classified as artiodactyl. And so the question is, do we now expand the classification of cetacean to include Indohyus, or that this specific feature ceases to now characterize cetaceans, right? This is the problem with taxonomical classification systematics. Why should we call Pakicetus clearly just a land-dwelling animal? Why should we call Pakicetus a cetacean or walking whale? Because apparently this special ear bone that characterizes a cetacean except when it doesn't work. So it's subjective and it's arbitrary. So this whale ancestor most often cited is Pakicetus, discovered in Pakistan, a four-legged land animal, somewhat like a wolf. In reality, the original fossil consisted of only the skull, and years later, more partial bones were added. Yet the artist's sketches of the creature show it swimming and catching fish. Is this convincing evidence of a pre-whale? No. So basically, when they first found these fossils, very scattered, fragmented, okay, a lot of it missing, they depicted Pakicetus like this, because this is the basic body type morphology that they need for whale transitions. This is how they depicted it. Once they found more bones, so notice here, Gaindrich, his first reconstruction. Then what they actually found, the more complete skeleton, this is the new reconstruction. Totally different from the original reconstruction. And that's why, fossils are fickle and they can essentially sing any story that you want them to. So Pakicetus, nothing special about Pakicetus. Yes, the involucrum, this ear bone, it is present also in Indohyus, which is not classified as a cetacean. But remember, today, the diversity that we see on the planet is only a snapshot of the overall diversity that has existed on the planet. So the pre-flood world, which is reflected in the fossil record, comprises significant amount of diversity. And so in the fossil record, we find some land mammals with some interesting features that land mammals today may not have. Okay, so here's some good information. As more fossils are discovered, our concept of the anatomical diversity of certain groups must expand. And that was the question with Indohyus. And that's why they did not include Indohyus as a cetacean. Certain anatomical traits thought to be unique or particular to particular mammalian orders turn up as chimeric assortments in other orders. Rather than demonstrating evolution, the chimeric co-occurrence of cetacean and non-cetacean features in extinct mammals only shows that certain features thought to be essentially cetacean are not exclusively cetacean after all. And again, it makes sense of the fact that today's only a small snapshot of the overall biological diversity that has existed on the planet. So there's Pakicetus, nothing special about Pakicetus. Indohyus, okay, just a small land-dwelling mammal. Indohyus did have really dense bones, leg bones, and dense leg bones, similar to a hippo. What a hippo has actually helps animals in the water. And they specifically help them stay weighed down as they're moving around in the water. And scientists, they also looked at, in Indohyus, the ankle bone, which is actually called the astragalus, and it's shaped much like a pulley. And so these are a couple examples, just minor features or traits that they want to now put it in that whale lineage, when they're nothing more than, as I said at the beginning here, small land mammals. Okay, there's huge gaps we're going to see as we continue on these gaps. So the next one, popular one, Ambulocetus, lived about 48 million years ago in Pakistan as well, if I'm not mistaken. And you'll find in the conventional literature, you can also watch videos on this topic from proponents of evolution, and they'll point out that Ambulocetus wasn't great in the water, nor was it remarkable on land. And they'll tell you that it was a strong swimmer, but it was not that fast or efficient. On land, it's awkward. With its legs, they kind of splay out or widen out to the sides. and they have a belly that drags on the ground, essentially, nearly drags on the ground. And the snout is really elongated, which they would kind of need if they need something transitioning into a whale. But that's not a feature that says it's a cetacean. I mean, look at some dogs today, dog breeds like a greyhound. They got the long snout as well, but it was elongated, it was heavy, and it might have even been challenging to raise its head. But Ambulocetus was perfectly equipped and designed for its environment, that transitional environment from sea to land. And so it lived in partially freshwater environments where it hung out in the shallows to find prey. And so basically, this is nothing more than a mammalian ambush predator with a long snout, very similar to what? Crocodiles today, as they like to stay hidden and submerged in water as they sneak up on prey. Okay, so these are essentially mammalian crocodiles, which makes sense of the great diversity that's existed on this planet. Very interesting creature, not evolving into a whale. So the next fossil supposedly spanning the transition is Ambulocetus, a swimming mammal. Again, only partial remains were found, so very fragmented, dispersed, and shattered. What was recovered indicated that this animal was a powerful swimmer, propelling itself much like a walrus. Like some other mammals, it spent time on both land and in the sea, but this does not make it transitional. It goes back to the analogy I like to make. If we're made in the image of God, then we should get a sense for how God designed the biological world based on the way we design things. And we design interesting intermediate vehicles. Take the military amphibious assault vehicle, for example. It's not great on land. It's not great for just the sea, but it's perfectly designed and suited for that transitional environment between sea and land. So it's well designed for that intermediate environment. We also know that environment dictates morphology and phenotype a lot of the times. And so these creatures that existed in interesting pre-flood ecosystems and environments, their morphology and the traits that they have, the blending of these traits would match that environment. And that's what we see with Ambulocetus. But here's some interesting points right from the conventional literature, okay? Ambulocetus has its eyes raised up on the top of its head. This is a quote from Dr. Gaindrich, and he's discovered a lot of these fossils, and he even admits that given the way its eyes are raised up on the top of its head in a very strange way, very similar to a crocodile, it's also unusually large for an early whale. These are his words, not a creationist. And so maybe it's not in the main line or lineage of whale evolution. And evolutionary scientists such as Dr. Gaindrich believe that Ambulocetus is essentially a side branch and not the main line, a dead end. So here's Ambulocetus here. As I said earlier, it's just a mammal version of crocodiles, not evolving into a whale, nothing special in terms of evolution. And you can see that it was nothing more than a mammalian ambush predator. And it had a long snout, similar to other animals that we see today. So the next example, and we saw this in Crash Course video, is Rodhocetus. With Rodhocetus, there are a lot of inconsistencies, and I'm excited to go through these. So there's many inconsistencies between museum representations or reconstructions of Rodhocetus and reality, what we actually see with the fossils. Okay, so reconstructions, they comprise a whale fluke and flippers, but there were no fossils of the tail to actually verify or validate these reconstructions. Dr. Gaindrich has stated that he now doubts, and you can watch this interview, he now doubts Rodhocetus had a fluke. He was specifically asked the question about the fluke, and he pointed out that he once speculated that it did have a fluke, but now no longer believes this. He also doesn't believe Rodhocetus had flippers. Rodhocetus does not have the kind of arms that could be spread out in the same way the flippers of a whale are. And this is true. This is reality. And it's not just me saying this, because Dr. Gaindrich, an evolutionary scientist who discovered Rodhocetus, he's saying this exact same thing. He's expressed these concerns. And so if you don't have flippers, you probably don't have a fluke tail with power swimming. And that's why, again, when you have fragmented data, when you have the fossil record, which is essentially low quality science, low confidence science, then you're going to be able to reconstruct or imagine these creatures to look very dissimilar to how they actually looked in reality. Because remember, they have those evolutionary presuppositions going into these reconstructions. So notice this, the discoverer of Rodhocetus even made a glaring admission. He said, I speculated that it might have had a fluke. And that's how it's represented and reconstructed in museums and textbooks. I now doubt that Rodhocetus would have had a fluked tail. So next we get into Durodon and also Basilosaurus. These are just fully aquatic whales. And so the fully aquatic whales are quite different to the so-called walking whales that spend a lot of time in the sea, like Ambulocetus. So going back to our original slides here, notice we have Ambulocetus, these amphibious mammals, Ambulocetus, Pakicetus, Indohyus, just basic land mammals. Then we get into Basilosaurus and also Durodon. Durodon we have right here. So these are fully aquatic. These are primarily terrestrial and fully terrestrial. So the fully aquatic whales are quite different to the so-called walking whales that spend a lot of time in the sea, like right here, Ambulocetus. They vary in numerous ways. There's huge gaps. And right here, so Durodon. So we have huge gaps. A couple examples, blowholes. Blowholes, everybody knows, they're distinct. They're unique. They're located at the top of a whale's head. Whales also have flukes that are not at all like the tails found in these so-called walking whales. That's why they really wanted Rodhocetus to have a fluke. Flukes are well designed and ideal for swimming. They have tendons attached to muscles in the tail, where the fluke is essentially moving independently from the tail as the whale moves along in the ocean. These amphibious mammals, let's say like sea lions, they have external testicles. Whales actually have internal testicles, and the testicles must be cooled or else the animal is sterile. And if an animal is sterile, well, there's no forward evolution. There has to be reproduction. Genes and traits have to be passed along. Sterility is not going to help evolution. It's not going to help common descent. And so this is a very complicated, this is a very sophisticated system that we're dealing with here. There's substantial, extensive gaps between the amphibious mammals that we see here and the fully aquatic whales. Whales can also dive 1,000 feet deep and can hold their breath for over an hour. And so how have these things evolved? How has the blowhole evolved? You're going to get a lot of storytelling. The testicles have to be cooled. This has to happen at the same time as well, or else you're going to be sterile. Okay. And so those are just a few of the many problems. And remember, these novel anatomical features and traits, increases oftentimes in phenotypic complexity, have to happen in a short amount of time, evolutionary speaking. Okay. So Durodon is a type of basilosaurid. Same category of Basilosaurus. According to many evolutionary charts, basilosaurids were a precursor to modern whales. They are long serpent-like mammals with tiny appendages that are clearly too small for walking. But even evolutionists have expressed doubts that they are ancestral to modern whales. There's actually some overlap when it comes to the basilosaurids. Refuting evolution, quoted vertebrate paleontologist Barbara Jaffe Stahl, the serpentine form of the body and the peculiar shape of the cheek teeth make it plain that these archaeocetes, the basilosaurids, could not possibly have been the ancestor of modern whales. Okay, well, there that goes. Endohyus, Durodon, Basilosaurus, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus. It's a very weak chain that we have with many gaps. And remember, without genetic mechanisms, without a mechanism that we know and understand today for these changes to occur, all these are historical reconstructions with evolutionary presuppositions imposed on the data. It's not real science. So here's a skeleton of Durodon, this early whale. You can see the tiny hind limbs below the tail. So we're going to get into that. So Basilosaurus, same thing. Basilosaurus did have small hind limbs, certainly too small for walking. And Teaching Evolution says they were thought to be non-functional. So remember, we talked about earlier the created heterozygosity hypothesis or design diversity. So we would expect that these traits in morphology, anatomy, also in genetics when it comes to ERVs, allele sequences, pseudogenes, my specialty, these have function, these have purpose. These organisms are filled with treasure rather than junk and evolutionary leftovers. So we would always predict function, some kind of purpose. These are well designed. And so when we find a purpose or a function, that confirms design diversity, that confirms the common design model. So notice this, they were thought to be non-functional, but they were probably used for grasping during copulation, used for reproduction. See, this makes sense because if you look, remember, whales are a mammal. Sharks are a fish, and other fish in the ocean are different from mammals in many ways. They give birth to their live young with mammals and also breastfeed. And it's interesting because the baby whale comes out from the tail first, tail to the head, which makes sense so it doesn't drown. So you also have to have that breached position evolve as well. So there's another huge gap. And so the way mammals would reproduce versus how a lot of fish reproduce through, I believe it's called spawning, where you have like sharks or other fish would basically just drop their eggs, and then male fish would just drop their sperm and fertilize that way. Okay. Well, a mammal would require some kind of feature or trait to help with the way that it reproduces, the way that it has babies, especially in light of the fact that it has mammalian features. And so it turns out that these so-called small hind limbs are used for reproduction. And this isn't just creationists saying this. Notice this. For example, the evolutionary whale expert, Philip Gangrich, said, "It seems to me that they could only have been some kind of sexual and reproductive clasper." And that makes sense. This is right from the conventional literature. It's all in the hips. You can read this for yourself. New research turns a long accepted evolutionary assumption on its head, finding that far from being just vestigial, whale pelvic bones play a key role in what? Reproduction. So we have an essential function. Without reproduction, you definitely don't have evolution. You're not going to have kids. You're not going to be able to pass on your gene. So it'd be very difficult to reproduce without these. So here we go. Here's the conclusions. We've examined all of your icons of whale evolution. Indohyus and Pakicetus are small mammals. Ambulocetus, Myocetus, Couchicetus, and Rodhocetus were amphibious mammals. We've seen that. Ambulocetus essentially being a mammalian crocodile. Well designed for that transitional environment between sea and land. Not evolving into a whale. They spent part of their lives on land and parts in water. And then you've got Basilosaurus and Durodon that were just fully aquatic whales that had features, just like we see in whales today, that help with reproduction. They're not vestigial. And so some of these interesting mosaics, morphological intermediates, we shouldn't use as Cratius the word transitional because there's an assumption built into that it's one creature transitioning into another. That's why they look to these basal features, or they'll look to synapomorphies, apomorphies, they'll look to basal and derived features, and they're assuming that, well, your transitional is going to have the features, some features of the ancestor and also from the descendant. And when they say primitive or basal, that's also based on evolutionary assumptions. They're actually assuming that this is primitive and this is basal, rather than just a well-designed trait, a well-designed feature, which oftentimes can be subject to degeneration. We see that a lot with the hominids, that they're pathological, but they're interpreted as being primitive or basal. Okay, no, we don't use the word transitional. We can use mosaic or morphological intermediate is good, because again, the word transitional assumes that this is one creature that's transitioning into another from another. So before the flood, there were probably biological communities unfamiliar to us today. We can understand that just by looking at the fossil record and seeing how diverse the world was in terms of plants, in terms of animals. Pre-flood ecosystems were probably more tightly structured than today and strongly biozoned. For example, the major plant groups arranged from ocean inland according to their ability to reproduce without standing water, and plant group specific animal taxa tracking the biozonation. So the point is, the pre-flood world would have had different ecosystems, different sets of biodiversity. We find some interesting creatures that are now extinct, but in light of the gaps, in light of the faulty reconstructions, as we've seen with Rodhocetus, going back to Rodhocetus here, okay, these representations where the reconstructions comprise a whale fluke, but yet we don't have fossils that have validated or verified this reconstruction. So there's a lot of wishful thinking, there's a lot of storytelling, and a lot of evolutionary assumptions built into this whale evolution argument. So I'll wrap it up there, Matt. Any thoughts, brother? And is there any information or data points that you wanted to contribute to this argument from whale evolution?
No, that was your puppy today. That was what you've been working on for a while. I was just last minute gathering up stuff for the geologic record.
Well, think about it. And I've got a book here. This might be a good topic for when we have Dr. Jerry Bergman back on, but he's got a very impressive section in fossil forensics going in detail on these so-called hind limbs found in creatures like Basilosaurus and also Durodon, fully aquatic whales. But he goes in detail, page after page, and all confirmed as well by the conventional literature on what these are used for in terms of reproduction, but in detail on each of the bones that are found. And so I went into studying, obviously, how necessary are these features for reproduction and copulation, right? And so, Matt, in light of the way fish like a shark would reproduce and an aquatic mammal like a whale would reproduce, don't these features make sense that these creatures have them?
Well, I would say not only that, where in the world does it create or evolve the reproductive organs from its legs? If these are vestigial leg bones that turned into reproductive organs, where was the transition where it wasn't that and they gave something new? Kind of like humans from primates, right? Where did the baculum bone disappear to, and when did we evolve a brand new organ for reproduction? Where was that transition? It had to be instant, or you can't have, right? You can't have a slow progression of it. So what was going on in the whale? It had to be the same as the human, right? In the line. Exactly.
Well, it's just like we see with these amphibious mammals, like sea lions and then also Ambulocetus. They have external testicles. Whales have internal testicles. So they would have to cool in order for them to not be sterile. So all of that evolution of these independent features and traits are going to happen simultaneously, or it's not going to work.
Right. Exactly. And you made an interesting thing. You were kind of describing like a walrus to me earlier. That's what it sounded like when you said it just lays on its belly and sometimes raises up. But it's a mammal, right? So that sounds like a walrus, just an elongated face.
Right. And so it makes sense. You know, today we have these reptiles. And so here's Ambulocetus, right? And so right from the conventional literature, I read many articles, papers on this topic, watched many videos from an evolutionary perspective, and they've admitted that Ambulocetus, Matt, wasn't really all that good in the water. It wasn't remarkable on land. It may have been a strong swimmer, but it wasn't efficient. It wasn't fast. Its belly was awkward, could have dragged on the ground. It had that long and heavy snout. It was awkward in the way its legs were kind of splayed out to the side. And it was an ambush predator, very similar to crocodiles. And so doesn't it make sense in light of how diverse the fossil record is, the pre-flood world, that we would have a mammal version of a crocodile, even if extinct today?
I mean, if we're talking about that creature being alive today, if it only lived in a tropical, shallow region, then and during the flood, that area got destroyed, and there's no place right after the flood because there's an ice age, I can understand why it's missing. Yeah. So even if it did survive, it didn't survive for very long when there was an ice age.
Right. You know, and looking into this, I discovered some detailed explanations from even some in the young earth creationist camp that have suggested, well, maybe you had land dwelling cetaceans that after the flood, due to pre-programmed diversity, could have evolved into these fully aquatic cetaceans. But in light of the examples that they actually have with Endogenous, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Durodon, Basilosaurus, I don't believe we need to go to that point, because the examples that they provide are not strong enough or convincing enough for us to have to say, well, the ark had walking whales that evolved or adapted to the sea and the ocean, an aquatic lifestyle, because of the many gaps. And when you break it all down, again, you got these examples that are just fully aquatic, primarily terrestrial, interesting creatures, and then fully terrestrial. So we're seeing too many gaps for us to go to that extent. Matt, would it be your opinion as well that we wouldn't have to say, well, there may have been an Ambulocetus kind of creature coming off of the ark that over the next 1,000 years evolved into a fully aquatic mammal? What are your thoughts on that, brother?
Well, evolution teaches that a species, a parent ancestor, doesn't have to die off for it to evolve into a new species that goes along and becomes other aquatic species. So where are the Ambulocetus? Where are the ancestors? Clearly, they could have survived because they lived during a time when smaller organisms and species did live, right? According to the evolutionary theory. So it should have done just fine if it was able to live in the environment that it was. So where did they go? Like, what's going on here? Because it's not like a linear process where it evolved into one thing and then the original parent ancestor just disappeared. So what's going on? To place them on the ark is very strange, but nonetheless, I guess if they think that was a possibility, that would be some rapid evolution occurring,
right?
To go into a whale from one of the smallest land mammals.
And I don't believe it's necessary in light of the fact that we have these gaps and we can break down these creatures in light of their discontinuities. There's a lot of discontinuity in what we're saying here, enough to have different groups that are unrelated to each other. Like,
right, they disagree.
Right.
Yeah, the professionals themselves disagree. So if they're not even in agreement, it's very similar to, again, human evolution. There's no concordance. They disagree with one another on everything. It's just stories.
Well, just like Dr. Philip Gingrich, discoverer of Rodhocetus, ended up admitting that Rodhocetus didn't even have a tail fluke. We don't have any evidence for the tail fluke, the evolution of it. We don't have evidence of the blowhole, right? Because these amphibious mammals have their nostrils right at the front, and those would basically have to migrate to the back of the head like we see with mammals. And even if they found a series of fossils where you had, the nostrils a little more up, then they're going to put those in a line, and then they're going to imagine, wow, it went from here, the front, to the top.
Right.
Even that would be wishful thinking.